I was having a conversation with someone recently who's setting up his own 5-acre homestead, and he came to me and he asked, what do you think could cause the next round of food shortages? Or really, what kind of apocalyptic happenings are pushing you and motivating you to farm right now? At that moment, a lot of things started to swirl through my head. World war, currency collapses, grid collapses, extreme drought, political upheaval, and more. All the stuff you see swirling around on YouTube and the news every day. But I actually paused before answering him because while I do believe the worst is yet to come with respect to what we're going to see in the world, I'm honestly farming not because of what I think will happen, but because of what has already happened. And in this video, I'm going to cover 4 black swan style events that have happened in recent or very recent history, events during which I've taken notes and formulated a personal set of plans, and I'm going to share those with you in hopes that maybe it will help you in the same way. Now, as a side note, I believe what I just said with respect to the worst is yet to come without fear, because ultimately I trust in the Lord and not my farm as my ultimate source of security, and I can share that with you because he invites you to trust him in the same way. So this is not a fear-mongering thing. This is a facts thing. So back to the conversation with this guy. I answered him just like that. I said I'm not so much worried for what's going to happen as I am acting on what I know has already happened. I shared with him that during 2020, I kept having this phrase run through my mind. This is a drill. This is a drill. This is a drill. I had this intuition that COVID was not necessarily going to be a long-term disruption, but rather the opportunity to see how we would perform should a long-term disruption knock at our door. And how did we perform? Did our supply chains hold out? Did we personally have 1 to 2 months of backup food that we needed to get through that bottleneck? Did we have connections to our local farms? Should those supply chain disruptions have lasted 1 to 2 years instead of 1 to 2 months? Were we out in the middle of all of those panic buyers, scratching for what we needed, the basics, to make it through the first couple of months of the pandemic? For me personally, in 2020, the answer to a majority of these questions was definitely not to the positive, which is why I did jump into raising some of my own food and providing resources for those who would come in behind me. Which, by the way, if you click on the first link in this description, I will send you 2 of my most popular food growing guides for free. But COVID was really just one of 4 recent black swan events that we discussed. The second being just drought-induced famine. While we all remember the biggest one of the century, which was the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was a succession of 3 different intense droughts, which peaked in a 32% decrease in wheat production across the nation, more recently we've been facing the same kinds of droughts, primarily in the southwestern USA. The mega drought of 2019 to 2023 resulted in billions of dollars worth of loss for crop farmers across the USA, as well as an acceleration in the decline of the U.S. beef industry. For those wondering why we didn't see massive beef shortages during this time period, watch this video up here for how the USDA is allowing foreign beef to be labeled product of the USA and sold on supermarket shelves. But when the mega drought hit my farm here in Northeast Texas back in 2022, I saw those lines of ranchers liquidating cattle. But shortly after this, I found something out, that historically, old school ranchers would have 18 months worth of hay supply saved back, not as a pre-apocalyptic practice, but just as a preparedness practice, knowing that droughts are cyclical. They'd have what they needed to carry their herd through at least 1 major drought. Maybe not 3 in rapid succession, but they had what they needed for 1 season of drought. Seeing those lines and experiencing it for the first time myself at my farm, I realized we had totally abandoned just the most basic principles of prepping. And I took a lesson away from that, in that I myself am going to start stockpiling feed for my animals, especially during good years like this one, where the rainfall is excellent and hay is a little bit of a lower cost. The third event that we discussed in that conversation was World War. It's been nearly 80 years since the end of World War II. However, in the 84 years preceding the end of World War II, the United States had to brave 3 major wars. The Civil War ending in the 1860s, World War I ending in 1914, and World War II ending in 1945. This present 80-year span of relative peace within our borders is an anomaly, and a world war in the near future is not something to rule out. It was the Victory Garden movement of World War II that allowed civilians to produce 48% of their own food supply using their backyards. It was a major contribution to national security because a lot of commercially produced food products were shipping out to troops and allies on the front lines. And we can take that lesson from history and begin using our backyards, whether a quarter of an acre, a half of an acre, 10 acres, 20 acres, to begin producing food in a similar fashion. The fourth issue that we discussed was family emergencies. And while this is more general than historic, I recently heard a story of a mom who had begun gardening, canning, food prepping in expectation of something bad happening in the world. But then her husband was injured and was out of work for a year. And she used those food preps as a primary source of food during a time period when she and her husband were without income. This was an amazing reminder to me as a lady that you never know what you're prepping for. Taking seasons of abundance, putting back a few extra canned goods, some extra flour, a few more pounds of meat in the freezer whenever you can, may pay off in ways you never would have expected. I think over the past 4 years, what I've realized is the fact that we are prepared for so very little. We're not even talking about the apocalypse here. We're not even prepared to be out of an income for 12 weeks. We're living in such a state of not normal societally. We are relying on a farming population of 2% to feed our entire nation, which is not normal. 80% of our nation's beef supply is controlled by 4 different companies, which is not normal. Factory farming processes that cause a loss of soil at a rate 10 times that of replenishment is not normal. Having a cropping system that is entirely reliant on 1 billion pounds of cancer-causing pesticides is not normal. And having 300 million people tied to one grid is not normal. So while a return to normal may be labeled as prepping or apocalyptic, raising your own meat, milking your own cows, growing a garden, these were things that were just normal 60 or 70 years ago, and they hedged society against the cyclical disruptions that come. Now, I do believe we're going to see some major disruptions that are beyond cyclical, but how about let's start with prepping in a way that's going to hedge us from the norm. If you've stuck around this long, I am going to share with you a personal perspective. I personally am preparing for a massive disruption in critical supply chains. But here's the thing. I honestly hope that is 10 to 25 years away, because that's how much time that I and a significant group of people that will be necessary to move through that time period without our society collapsing will need to reestablish core skill sets and infrastructure. If I have children, it will likely be them who face on a large scale what I am prepping for based on what I see on a small scale. And it's my desire to hand them tools and skill sets that they need to face times of significant uncertainty. One of those tools and skill sets embodied in my book, The Basics of Raising Sheep on Pasture, which I self-published out of a desire to help beginner farmers get started in sheep on small acreage. And you can buy that book at shepherdess.com. It is a huge support to my work when you do. Watch this video next where I talk about the family that braved the Great Depression by growing all of their own food on a 7-acre homestead.